In the interest of active consent seeking, we will be removing all AI note-taking assistance during the call, and we will constantly keep checking that. So just be mindful in case you are associated with an AI note-taking app, they will be removed. To save bandwidth on the call, please do turn off your camera and keep yourself on mute while you are not speaking. But of course, in case you wish to ask a question or make a comment, feel free to sort of turn on your video and of course unmute yourself to ask that question or make that comment. Most of us here are fluent and are comfortable in Hindi or English, so feel free to ask your questions or make your comments in either of those two languages. And in case anyone does need help with translations, there are quite a few of us who can volunteer to help out with that. Feel free to use the chat box to leave your comments and questions, and it would be great if you could introduce yourself and your organization along with it when you do that, so it's easier for the panelists and speakers to sort of contextualize your question. And of course, please do try and keep us to time. The sessions are parallelly programmed, so any sort of extension of time here just kind of has a domino effect on the rest of the programming. So we'll have just a quick look at the agenda before I hand it over. We're at the 5-minute introductions, after which I will hand it over to the Vihara team to sort of set the context for the rest of the session. We will then have about 15 minutes of reflections from partners and experts who we brought on to have a panel discussion or like a dialogue, I guess. Then we have about 10 minutes of sort of exchanging words and sharing thoughts. And then, of course, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But just 2 minutes before we head into the session, I'd like to give a bit of a quick background to CoreNet, for those of you who are new, and I see there are quite a few new faces around here. So CoreNet, or the COVID Research Network, is an effort to build a community of practice to foster exchange and collaboration among research organizations, gathering information on issues relevant to COVID-19 pandemic in India. The CoreNet Secretariat has been anchored by Quicksand over the last year with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And over the year, we have sort of been able to gather 60 plus member organizations working across 23 geographies. We have more than 200 individual Slack members on our Slack community. We have about 80 submitted research projects on our web platform. We've hosted about 19 coffee hour sessions and 3 ethics dialogues, which is an attempt for us to kind of come together as a community and share interesting work, talk about interesting conversations that seem to be going on around us. And we thought after about a year of doing all this, the conference would be a great time for us to kind of come together and sort of bring together the community and engage with the larger set of stakeholders and bring together all our experiences and think about all the learnings we have as we move ahead. And I guess it comes at a more sort of poignant point where it almost seems like we're back to square one with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think we thought it was a good time to think about how much have we learned in the last year and where can we actually go from here. And before I hand it over to today's presenters, I'd like to quickly introduce them. So we have Divya from Vihara. She leads the work in gender, social vulnerability, and psychological health at Vihara. She brings expertise on social factors that perpetuate vulnerability and their impact on behaviors, mental models, and decision-making patterns. She has extensive experience of working with families, women and children and FLWs from the lens of socioeconomic factors, gender and cultural norms, social and familial dynamics, along with a strong understanding of the health system and last mile delivery. We have Damni, who is a design researcher on the Pathways team at Vihara. Damni's work focuses on understanding risk factors that impact the health and well-being of families in low-income groups and the access to critical health services, both from the user and system perspective. She's currently managing research studies that map the ongoing impact of COVID-19 on care-seeking and health coping behaviors of people, emerging perceptions around the disease, barriers and facilitators in health service delivery, and the shifting perspective and motivations of frontline cadre. Monisha is a senior research manager at Vihara. She's a development research professional with over 5 years of experience in the field of public health. At Vihara, her work involves drawing from a mix of practices, including ethnography, the behavioral science to gain user systems and design insights that inform innovative intervention strategies and solutions. In her current project, she has been applying a mix of ethnography and design research to understand how social and environmental risks contribute to vulnerability and impact maternal and child outcomes. She's an interdisciplinary education background ranging from media governance to policy studies, including constitutional and child rights law. We have Aparna, who is a health systems professional, policy enthusiast, and a researcher. She holds a medical degree, a master's in health administration, and an MPhil, and is currently pursuing a PhD in public health from TIS. She has about a decade of experience wherein she has worked with the central government, a national health mission in program management, and non-government organization named Sehat in Mumbai, and is currently with OPM India in the Frontline Worker Project. Sanaya is a senior researcher Senior Research Associate at Accountability Initiative. She began her career as a qualitative consumer researcher at Quantum Consumer Research, which is based in Singapore, using consumer insights to advise clients on brand positioning and marketing strategies. During this time, she also worked on human-centric design projects with Quantum Design Thinking Division. She then went on to pursue her master's in development studies, post which she joined Dasra, which is based in Mumbai. Sanaya's first worked in a project management role with Dasra sanitation team, building and facilitating collaborative platforms within the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation portfolio of water, sanitation, and hygiene. And her work spans across Southeast Asia, India, and China. And we have an incredible set of panelists. And with that, I'd just like to hand it over to the Vihara team. And I think, Divya, you'll be taking it from here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nitya. Thank you so much, CoreNet, for providing us this opportunity. And we're really excited to share some of these findings. And I hope they're a lot more pertinent right now, given the context and given what the country is sort of going through. Very quickly, I'll try and set the context for this work. For those who are not aware, this is work that is part of Pathways, the project. At large, this is a project that we are undertaking in a cross-geographic manner between Kenya and India. And it's a largely multidisciplinary project where we're looking at design-led approaches, anthropology, behavioral sciences on the qualitative end of things, while we also have integration with data sciences and quantitative data. And here in this project, we are trying to understand social, environmental, and structural factors that impact the ability of a family to provide care to women and children. And so largely focusing on factors that make women and children vulnerable to poor health outcomes. As sort of the pandemic hit, we had just concluded our qualitative data collection. And what we ended up doing is thinking about how to understand and leverage the connections that we had built during our qualitative data collection to identify and understand the impact of COVID-19 in lifetime and in real time, to humanize what is actually going on the field. And we leveraged our connections with families, women, but also frontline health workers that we built during our on-ground work. And the COVID research sort of is a longitudinal approach that we took, where we did our first sprint, which was very early in the lockdown. It was all kind of new. The restrictions were quite at large. Services were disrupted. But the second sprint happened now, which was stretching from November to February. And this sort of allowed us to capture a wider frame of time, but also concurrently touch upon aspects of increasing sense of normalcy and also panning towards the initial aspect of COVID vaccines that were administered to frontline health workers. So I'm going to invite my team, Damini and Monisha, to share some specific findings about the project and a little bit more about the geographies that we conducted this work in. Over to you, Damini.
Thanks, Divya. If you could just move to the next slide. Just as a quick overview for the next 20 minutes, the second sprint predominantly focused on first understanding the impact of the pandemic was having on the risk perception of the people, the shifting preferences for care providers, and the factors that really impacted their decisions and actions when they sought care. We will soon make this a part of the CoreNet platform as well, but for this particular session, we're focusing on the service side, especially towards understanding how ASHAs are able to cope with the complexities that have been amplified by this pandemic and what are the various factors that enable them to continue providing support and services to communities. We delve deeper into understanding how and why certain ASHAs are able to work more effectively than others, and what are the ways in which ASHAs continue to build and manage community trust in these times. Lastly, we focus on the ways in which we can leverage COVID expedited digital transitions in ASHA's work and in order to build more informed and effective frontline service delivery models. So the second sprint is, again, like we mentioned, a longitudinal study that builds from the larger Pathways geography and sample. We have followed the health journeys of people from 2019 until now through COVID to really understand what is the long-term impact of the socio-economic factors on their health and care-seeking behaviors. The research geographies include 3 districts each in UP and Bihar. In UP, we have Biharaich and Gorakhpur that have continued from previous sprints. We have added Varanasi as a new district for this particular study. In Bihar, we have Jamui and Darbhanga from previous sprints, and Nalanda as a new district. Between these geographies, we try to cover rural, tribal, and low-income urban areas with different socio-cultural and economic backgrounds to bring in all kinds of diversity. The overall sample included over 65 qualitative engagements. We remotely conducted in-depth interviews with over 32 families, 21 ASHAs and ASHA facilitators, and around 8 care providers that included ANMs, RMPs, and pharmacists. The sample was selected in a way that we were able to speak to families and frontline workers from the same neighborhood. So this enabled us to triangulate the information and just gain a broader community-level understanding of how both the frontline workers and beneficiaries were experiencing coping with the pandemic. We broke our engagements over 3 calls per respondent, spread over 3 months to really track their experiences through November until February of 2021. If we could move on to the key, thanks. So we begin by delving deeper into how ASHAs managed to deliver on the work and what they had to do to really continue providing the health services. So we saw that the pandemic had brought to fore ASHA's unique position as a link between both the community and the health system. And as the constraints around the work amplified during COVID, ASHAs had to put in that extra effort into balancing and managing their engagements, specifically on 3 fronts: their engagements with the public health system, the community they were serving, and their own families. We know from our field experiences that the pandemic has really amplified and still continues to exacerbate these systemic inefficiencies. If we could move to the next slide. So with systemic inefficiencies on one end, ASHAs are also facing, and especially in the initial periods of the pandemic, they've faced this increased bias and mistrust from the communities that they were serving. But to us here, really the most pivotal element is the support that ASHAs actively receive from their families and the impact that it had on their motivations and abilities to work. We'll talk more on this in the coming slides. But at the center of all of these balancing act is the ASHA herself. We observed that some ASHAs were really able to manage better than others, and their ability to cope was born out of a complex interplay between their own mindsets and motivations, the support that they received, and the relationship that they had with the community and the health system. So many studies have already highlighted again the extent of systemic disruptions, which has impacted access to care for many people. Even after all the services have resumed, people continue to face accessibility issues, service unavailability, or even multiple referrals, especially with the high-risk patients. And all of this has led to extreme delay in care seeking. This is also amplifying in the current surge. And since ASHAs are really perceived as a representative of the health system, they become answerable for such systemic issues, which really reflect poorly on their image and trust within the community. For instance, the no-contact checkups during the COVID really built a community perception that patients are not receiving quality care because the doctors weren't touching them. And people avoided going to the government hospitals due to the fear of catching COVID or fearing the refusal of service. So any nudge or advice that the ASHA gave to families towards seeking care at a public facility was undermined due to this pervasive lack of trust. So in response to manage this community trust, ASHAs had to find workarounds to really get them timely and quality care. One of the ASHAs that we spoke to talked about how she stopped referring to people to the PHC, which she knew had a high number of COVID patients. She feared that the community would blame her if any of them contracted the disease at the hospital. So she instead referred them to the local private clinic where she felt that they could avoid potential referrals and receive care in time. Moreover, in COVID, we also saw ASHAs curating advice and services for communities, especially around vaccinations. ASHAs didn't have adequate information from the health system. So to respond to the questions that were coming in from the communities, ASHAs took it on themselves to source the right information and develop ways of explaining it in ways that align with the mental models of the community so that they could get their advice across in time. From the past studies, again, we know that the functional and emotional support that ASHA receives from her family has a huge impact on her motivations to work. And the support can manifest in different ways, such as family members listening to her distress or concerns, other female members taking on more domestic responsibilities in her absence, the husband driving her to and fro for work, or even children taking on some of the cold calling outreach services. But for many ASHAs, COVID directly impacted such support structures and to an extent even strained home dynamics, both of which really impacted her mental state in these times. And I would like to elaborate on this by taking two different examples. First is Ratna, who we met during the study and who's an Asha in a rural community in UP. So she talked about how she had to spend 2 nights away from home at public hospitals so that she could mobilize care for this woman with a high-risk pregnancy. And over the course of those 2 days, the patient was referred from the PHC to the district hospital and then to a private clinic. And Ratna was there to facilitate the whole process. And she feels that she was only able to do so because of the support that the allowance of her, and the fact that her mother-in-law managed the task and situation at home in her absence. On the other hand, we have cases like that of Geeta. Geeta's family feared that she would contract COVID at work and infect them. So they wanted her to stop working completely. This escalated to one time when they locked her at home so that she couldn't go to work. So her family feared to contract the disease and infect them, and they wanted her to leave. So Geeta had to conciliate between things that were coming from her family and also meeting all the deadlines and obligations at work, which took a toll on both her mental and physical health. On the community front, onto the next slide, again, Ashas were actively managing the trust and their image within the community. For example, we saw that certain Muslim communities were hostile to Ashas and didn't let them work in their neighborhood during the COVID surveys, since they feared that giving away any personal information would lead to some sort of forced quarantine or arrest. So Ashas had to again very carefully navigate such situations to really regain the trust of these members by pivoting themselves as the representative of the community and reiterate the sentiment that she had their best interests at heart. Moreover, Asha's movements and interactions within the community had to also be carefully managed and be aligned to the expectations at home. We spoke to Urmila, her family again wanted to reduce her interactions with the people outside the home. So this compelled her to not visit certain homes and communities of different caste or religion based on the family's values. Or she asked some member in her family to accompany her at her work to communities which she thought were hostile or where she feared some potential verbal or physical altercation. So in conclusion, these constant negotiations on all the fronts became COVID stressors for many Ashas, and it took a severe toll on their mental and physical health. Again, these negotiations also continually influenced Asha's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation factors and consequently impacted her ability to work effectively. So for instance, on the system level, factors such as independent income, peer support, exposure to the community resources, and increased awareness of her own health and body by the way of her work were big motivators for Ashas. But at the same time, COVID negatively impacted these motivations as Ashas faced increased workload, suspension of salaries, loss of peer support from other Ashas, and even reduced in-person interactions and training. On the community front, the social recognition of their work, increased mobility and social interactions due to the nature of their jobs, and the ability to really sit and work with the decision makers of the community are big motivation factors for Ashas to continue working. And even after the lockdown, Ashas have enjoyed this ability to freely move around within the community and speak to people, all of which again motivates them to work more diligently. On the family front, as we mentioned earlier, the support that they were receiving from the families and the pride that their family feel in their work are big motivators. One Asha talked about how when her husband went about in the village, people referred to him as the Asha's husband and wished him well. So such social recognition instills both in her and her family a sense of pride towards her work that enables them to enables the family to support her work better. On the personal front, Ashas feel that this work is one of the very few socially acceptable and respected career choices available to them. One Asha we spoke to talked about how, despite the stress that she's undergoing at work currently, she will continue working because if she quits this job, she may not be able to work again. Then again, the sense of accomplishment that they feel from their work has to be amplified because so many Ashas feel that COVID is not spreading in their communities because of their hard work intelligence, because they were out there getting all the surveys done, reporting all the people who may have had COVID. So again, the fact that COVID did not spread in their communities further motivates them to continue working harder at this stage. So far, we've touched upon how Ashas have continually negotiated on these fronts, and the factors that really play a huge role in their ability to manage and continue providing good service. But from our fieldwork, we also know that some Ashas are doing it better than others. So, in the next few slides, we want to dig deeper into understanding their engagements with the community, their interactions with their own family and the health system, to understand what some archers are doing differently that really enables them to manage communities' trust more effectively. For this, I'm handing it over to you, Manisha.
So I'll build on the points that Damini has already mentioned. So essentially, as we all know, that up until now, till this new surge sort of affected, rural India experienced COVID as essentially a social economic challenge rather than a health issue for most part of the last year. And within that context, while facing all the hardships that Ashas faced this and working throughout the pandemic, there were some Ashas, as Damini mentioned, who were able to leverage their position and address these socioeconomic challenges and serve their community in multiple ways, not just for their health, but they actually went beyond the outreach health services, which allowed them to actually build and sustain community trust and put her in a stronger position to then actually influence the uptake of healthful behaviors. So most Ashas who were proactive and efficient were doing these key three things in a very different and distinct way, which not only made them more efficient, but also led to them doing the system mandated activities much more efficiently. One of the ways that we identified is that how Ashas who went beyond health, meaning Ashas who were able to help the community address their base socio-economic and even emotional challenges, be there as a pillar of support for the community and provide for the things that were not available to them, actually were the ones who commanded more respect and trust from the community. For example, we heard stories of Ashas saying that we were the ones who were trying to arrange for ration for families who were in need. We were the ones who were trying to even arrange for money when they needed for emergency care seeking. We were the ones who were trying to deliver groceries and their essential needs to their doorstep, which was not our work, but we did it because we felt responsible. And what it did was it established the community's faith and trust in them again. And only because she was able to do that and go beyond health was a key reason how she was able to counter the earlier the fear and stigma and discrimination that they had started facing early in the pandemic because of them being perceived as outsiders. So they were able to counter that by going beyond their duty and doing more than what was just mandated. Another way in which they were able to do so was put the community first. So we know for very long the frontline workers have faced this challenge and lack of trust from the community because they are essentially seen as representatives of the health system, and all the inefficiencies of the health system are sort of put upon their shoulders. But what they tried to do in this past year was this one pivotal shift, that they tried to position themselves as community representatives rather than the face of the health system. So by doing and keeping people's and communities' interest in mind and looking at what the community needs first rather than what the health system requires them to do, they were able to break that trust barrier and open this two-way street wherein the community came to them to ask for help and advice and information. People in these COVID times were telling us that I will first go to the ASHA to confirm certain information instead of believing in it entirety, which is a very substantial shift and very crucial in these times. They also attended to the community's need by understanding the fear and stigma in the community instead of dismissing it. So there were ASHAs who would understand if a family refuses to go to the local PHC, and they would understand where the family is coming from, and then try to find other care providers in the vicinity. If the ASHAs would have just done what the health system mandates, and they would not have been able to maintain that same level of trust. So the more efficient and proactive ASHAs were able to make sure that by keeping the community first, they are also able to then leverage their new position, sort of their stronger position in the community, to mobilize them in the right way and mobilize them for high-risk pregnancies or mobilize them for key care-seeking behaviors. What it also led to at the individual family level is a greater trust of the family in the ashas. So at the individual beneficiary level, what by knowing the needs of one particular family, by knowing their past history, by knowing the family dynamics of that particular family, by knowing what works for that particular family, the ashas were able to tailor their advice. So in one instance, there was Nasha who was able to identify that the woman in this house does not have support from her family members. So she was able to go to that home and actually talk to the mother-in-law and the family members and generate that support for her beneficiary within her household. So with this consistent in-person interaction with the women and her family, the Asha was able to address the familial dimensions and make sure that the uptake of her advice and information is actually happening. Apart from these three things, one major shift that happened during this era of the pandemic was this transition to digital. There were substantial ways in which Asha started using digital platforms in ways in which they had never before done. So this expedited shift to the digital, though it varied across geography, but it actually led to the Ashas actively adopting these platforms for activities such as, say, mobilizing for immunization, doing follow-ups via phone, checking in on the health of mothers and infants, and also for her system level activities, which was upward reporting, coordinating with other FLWs, and even the PHC. Now, after actually experiencing the use of these digital technologies for some time, Ashas are now able to articulate the need for a balance between digital and in-person engagements in order to sustain the all-important trust within the community and with the beneficiaries while ensuring effectiveness. So with this experience, the Ashas emphatically suggest that interpersonal communication is essential to their services like counseling, and which require high level of trust to be built and maintained with the beneficiary. Not just that, they are also able to articulate how digital is actually limiting some of that. So they're very clear on the activities that they prefer doing online and the ones that they prefer doing in person because of ways in which digital impedes on interpersonal communication. And other big issue that they actually mentioned was through the example of how they will not be able to connect with all beneficiaries in the same way if they were to provide for counseling services digitally, because the access of digital infrastructure to women remains, as we all know, limited. So what we want to emphasize now is, from our work, what we understand is that for a design of better service delivery model, we need to keep in mind both the aspects of offline and online in mind. From this work that we have done, we understand there are some things that require more interpersonal communication because you need to build more trust and rapport. So trust and rapport is on one end of the spectrum, while scale is on the other. So scale becomes important to address in some spaces wherein, from an efficiency point of view, because from an efficiency point of view, scale becomes vital. But for services that require that connection to be made with the family and understand the needs of the family, trust and rapport takes precedence. Another important thing here to note is actually the level of mobilization that the Ashas are required to do. So there are certain activities, as we all know, which are recurring, which she has to do every day or every month, which require high levels of mobilization, and the beneficiary load for which is very high. For instance, VHSND days, mobilizing for immunization, is a recurring activity for which we saw that intent in the beneficiaries is already built. So now for these activities, the Ashas were able to do certain elements of the mobilization digitally because the activity was recurring, the scale is so high, and it helped them to do it digitally because it reduced their workload, it was less laborious, it was time efficient. Whereas on the other hand, activities such as counseling for, say, family planning or complementary feeding, even though the beneficiary load is higher, but because they are not recurring activities and they don't require as much mobilization, but what they require is high level of trust and rapport to be built with the families. So they were very clear on how digital can only support in counseling activities by providing them with means of, say, narrative-based games or narrative-based interactive aids that could help them efficiently and more emphatically give their message out to the families. But that element of interpersonal communication to build the trust and rapport is essential for services like counseling. On the systemic end, just the key point is that there were many activities which we know are recurring, like upward reporting, coordination, which can easily be transitioned to digital. But what it requires is right kind of hand-holding and training support, because we saw, and I'll elaborate it in the next slide also, that in cases where the ASHA facilitators were able to provide the right kind of training and hand-holding support to ASHAs are the cases wherein ASHAs were able to adopt the digital platforms in a much smoother way and use them much more efficiently. So what we know from this is that for any transition to digital service delivery model, the key things to note is, of course, digital access and reach. And we know this is one of the most monumental challenges, but in all our interactions, digital access is where people get stuck. So we know digital access is one of the key things to address, but parallelly, we need to keep in mind what are the other elements of digital service delivery that we need to or start working upon to ensure that we are building something that is both efficient and is decreasing the work of the FLWs instead of increasing them, and is affecting the beneficiaries in a more positive way. So systemic alignment is one wherein the system has to ensure that the FLWs are not doing the work is not duplicated in their way, and the policies are made in a way which keep the needs of both the beneficiaries and the FLWs in mind. And the third most important thing is the actual hand-holding and training support, which we also found out was done best in person and not digitally, because the ASHAs were able to receive that kind of support from the ASHA facilitators who actually called them at their own home and talked to them and trained them on certain aspects which they found difficult to sort of understand and catch up digitally. So I'll just conclude now, keeping the time in mind. The point we're trying to make is that there are things that ASHAs have been able to do and do efficiently on their own, which now need to be recognized by the system and which need to be strengthened by the system, so that to ensure that the ASHA feel supported and provided for, while not hampering their own sort of work life or personal life, and cater to the beneficiaries effectively. I'll hand over to Divya for the discussion now.
Thank you so much. And I'm really sorry, Damini and Monisha, I was rushing it, but I think that it's important to also hear some reflections and thoughts from Sanaya and Arpana from the work that they've done. And in our preceding conversations, we realized how many synergies were there when we were discussing about our works. So thank you so much for that. And I think with this, without sort of wasting too much time, I'll sort of move in to invite Sanaya to come up and talk about some of the reflections. Her introduction has already been made, but she's from Accountability Initiatives. And I think today she's going to be talking about their work with the frontline health workers in Rajasthan and Himachal Pradesh, and how COVID has sort of impacted it and what their findings are, focusing more per se on motivation and support for FLW. So over to you, Sanaya.
Thanks a lot, Divya. So I'll try to make this as short as possible because I know we're running behind time. But to just give you a brief overview of what the study was about, we conducted this fieldwork in December and January 2020 and 2021, and we published the report in January. And this was funded by a grant from the Azim Premji University. The idea behind this study is that through our relationship with CORNET as well, we were aware of the past work that has been done with frontline workers since in the context of the pandemic, and much of the past work earlier in 2020 focused on understanding the new COVID-related roles. But around October, November, through our network of state partners, we realized that there was increasingly a shift towards going back to regular work duties as well as continuing with COVID duties. So the aim of our research was to understand how the nature of work has changed in the context of the pandemic and what the key learnings for policymakers in the future could be and what best practices could extend to even beyond the pandemic. So it was a mixed method study, which we conducted with Anganwadi workers, ASHA workers, and ANMs. And we had a quantitative sample of about 351, and we had a qualitative sample of about 14. And this was conducted in 2 districts in Rajasthan, Jaipur and Udaipur, and 2 districts in Himachal Pradesh, Kangra and Solan. And overall, the framework that we adopted was the means, motives, and opportunity framework to understand workplace and employment dynamics to some extent. And these kind of frameworks have been used across both the development and corporate sectors as well to understand how better to support employees.
So today, Bihara invited me to speak specifically about two themes that came through in the report. We have covered other themes which can be viewed in the report and on the Accountability Initiative website. But today I'm focusing just on motivations and support networks. And within motivation, I'll talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And within the support network, I'll talk about supervisors, community, families, and also support from other frontline workers as well. So quickly moving into the motivation segment. When it came to financial incentives and specifically for ASHAs, our quantitative research found that 96% of ASHAs in Himachal Pradesh and 74% in Rajasthan reported having received the COVID incentive that they were due by the states. And according to the government circulars we looked up, the COVID incentive by Himachal Pradesh was to be between 1,000 to 2,000 rupees, depending on the month of payment. And in Rajasthan, 1,000 rupees. And so they reported receiving 6,900 on average in Himachal Pradesh and 3,300 on average in Rajasthan. But this was payment was not due to the other frontline workers. It was only ASHA workers who received this incentive. From qualitative insights, the insights about how incentives influence motivation, that came through is that receiving timely payments was especially critical for single women or for women whose husbands had been unemployed due to the pandemic. And the discussion around delaying payments is not just in the pandemic period. Even prior to the pandemic, there has been research and grassroots knowledge to show that that systematic delay of wages is an issue. And in fact, that was one of the motivations for ASHA strikes that have been seen in some parts of the country, where strikers were demanding better pay and timely payments. When moving into non-financial incentives, we got some really insights that came through from the qualitative research. And in the COVID period, many frontline workers felt motivated by the sense of performing a duty for their community, performing a duty for their nation, and even a sense of patriotic pride to some extent. And these feelings could have been motivated by messaging from the central government about COVID warriors and COVID heroes, etc. And I'll discuss also how this played out at the ground level. So at the ground level, only 58% actually reported feeling recognized in non-financial ways. And this increased incentives came through in praise from supervisors, certificates, felicitations by the panchayat, and even more informal praise from community members. And on a softer level, they also felt pride when community members approached them to ask for knowledge about COVID. And a lot of them did take, because some of their duties involved educating community members about COVID and about social distancing practices, they felt a sense of pride that they were able to impart this information and help out their communities. When it comes to support, in terms of supportive supervision, only 11% reported challenges with supervision in the quantitative part of our project, but in the qualitative interviews, we received some further information. So there were supervisors who were really good, and those supervisors were good in terms of a flexible time, in terms of understanding competing priorities for frontline workers, and in terms of escalating and resolving payment issues, PP issues, and helping out when there was a community backlash by calling the police, etc. But unsupported supervisors were also present, primarily in terms of lack of understanding their workload and forcing them to meet a certain quota of house surveys per day and not being flexible on that. So when it comes to the other part I wanted to mention was support from other frontline workers. So we did see some increased instances of frontline workers supporting each other in terms of sharing knowledge with each other, accompanying each other on visits, and from a safety perspective as well. From the community, 70% did report facing challenges from communities in terms of verbal abuse, in terms of resistance to quarantine measures, resistance to being tested for COVID, etc. And this seemed to stem from a community stigmatization and fear of COVID, to the extent that some frontline workers were refused transport and buses, for example. Fortunately, instances of physical abuse were much lower, at about 5%. And I'll speak about the family support later in our discussion.
I'll just quickly invite Arpana from OPM to also talk about their study in Jharkhand and reflecting more specifically on the digital technology piece and her reflection and thoughts on it. Over to you, Arpana.
Thank you, Bihara, for giving me this opportunity to speak about this topic. So the essential bit that I wanted to reflect on and was asked to speak on was the unique position that ASHA holds within the health system. So as during one of my works in Jharkhand, very aptly, one of the support staff of the ASHA program described them as a bridge and as a setu. she literally described it by saying कि वो लोगों को स्वास्थ्य पद्धति से जोड़ने का काम करती है. And that's an important point in the work of a community health worker, because while this health system work functions as a provider, the community as a recipient, the facilitator happens to be the ASHA. So what does it mean in terms of the position that she holds? The implication basically falls on the fact that she becomes answerable to both the system and the people. So the expectation out of her to be able to provide certain services, the expectation of the system to be able to deliver on certain fronts is something which is very real, and also functions within the whole dynamics of how the expectation of from a household level stands. As she is recognized as a voluntary worker, so she really isn't a salaried employee or something similar to an A&M, but an ASHA is a voluntary health worker who is paid based on her performance and based on the task that she performs. So while this presents as an opportunity for the health system to gain community level insights as to what the community needs and sees her as a representative of the community, the presence of the health system in the community is by way of an ASHA. So when any of the when ASHAs are selected from marginalized communities, it provides an opportunity for the system as well to have those voices represented through the ASHA. So when I say that represented by the voice, it's also contingent of the platform she's provided to speak on, or opportunities. But those happen at a very informal level as well, because when there is proximity to the system, there are opportunities informally also adapted. For example, if an ASHA is escorting a pregnant woman and is not able to mobilize an ambulance, they have regular meetings. So when she's asked why are deliveries not increasing in your area, so there they have an opportunity to say, because we have a problem in transportation, which presents an opportunity for the system to recognize what are the needs based on the context and the people as well. At a community level, she influences health behaviors, generate demand for services, and acts as a repository of information. So now in the rural area, the ASHA program is fairly mature. It's been about 15 years. While we allude to the work that she's done during COVID and the trust that people have had for her as a go-to person for information, it also comes from a bit of a background in terms of how she's been able to demonstrate a certain level of work previous to COVID, and which was sort of leveraged during COVID. So taking examples from one of the ASHAs that I came across, who said that it was earlier very difficult to mobilize people for vaccination. While the measles, rubella vaccination happened, many people had this thing about our children will get, they will die, and they will get fever and disease, etc. But to be able to come to this level, to be able to build that trust, which has been an ongoing effort. And COVID as a crisis was also a fear in itself. So the stigmatization, the abuse that happened that ASHAs faced was also owing to the situation and the chaos that happened with the sudden announce of lockdown and the way we communicated the message of the pandemic to the people itself. At an individual level, by way of interaction, ASHAs also gain social recognition, which has highly been alluded upon in the literature and both the studies that Accountability Initiative and Bihara has done. So what does this network really mean in terms of ASHA's position? One of the ASHAs in Bihar during our OPM work alluded that I tell my husband, maybe I'm not earning that much money, but more people in the village know me. And that sense of empowerment and that sense of self-accountability that they gain through this recognition, holding themselves responsible for certain activities of being able to provide services, is very essential to which she functions and builds that trust and relationship. Now, coming on to the digital aspect, how COVID actually made digital use a platform that had to be recognized because of the way the interaction happened and the limitations of communication. So while so during our telephonic surveys also, we found that ASHAs were informed about the protocols, etc., through training done through WhatsApp or messages through call centers, etc. However, this was probably the best use or the best way that the system could think of, comes with challenges of the training that is imparted earlier in the ASHA program. The ASHA program has been dependent on residential trainings for various skill building trainings. So that's why I would say that digital technology that was utilized during the COVID did present us with a thought that we need to start thinking of situations where and how we use digital technology. Because while there are platforms available for trainings and tried and tested in many resource constrained settings like Mobile Academy, which is essentially a tool by which ASHAs can learn about maternal and child healthcare. But once it's mandated, we do have to take into the context of the access and the digital literacy amongst the ASHAs, because while we do know that a significant population do not have access to digital devices and aren't really comfortable with operating many applications, etc. So that gives an opportunity to think of how do we contextualize those initiatives with respects to ASHA.
Thank you, Sanaya, and thank you, Arpana, for sharing these points and your reflections. I think I'll quickly sort of dive into the discussion itself, and I know that the chat has been active talking about the duration of ASHA workers, etc. But maybe because I gave a teaser early on, Sanaya, I want to sort of pull you in here, largely talking about this whole piece where we were talking about. I think the reason why we chose the name of women in the front lines is because this gender aspect of women actually being held responsible for household responsibilities, that they're women first, they're members of these families first. And along with that, they take on a lot of this effort, and they have to constantly balance and negotiate that gender role, and that those boundaries was quite significant. And resonating with that learning was this whole piece of the spectrum of support in families that Sanaya, your study brought about. So if you could sort of talk about that, but also reflect on the points where if you feel that lens can actually be incorporated in building this kind of supportive supervision that we've been discussing quite a bit. Is there a way to pull that lens and that spectrum in providing the right kind of support?
Sure, thanks for the question. And I think this the gender lens is not just through research, specifically frontline workers, but through other government sources of data, such as the National Time Use Survey, which was a massive qualitative study over a couple of years. And it documents how much more time women in India spend on household work and family care work than men do. And this is a really interesting perspective to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about frontline workers, all of whom are women. And when it came to supervision, for example, many supervisors didn't recognize that they had competing priorities in the home, or that they had other duties that family members were not picking up on, even when they had to work much longer hours in the COVID context. And the other ways in which we saw gender playing out was from the more patriarchal sense of fear of safety, especially in Himachal Pradesh, where frontline workers had to travel long distances. And their supervisors also sometimes assigned them households that were really far away. And so they had to travel back alone late in the night. And so some supervisors did take their complaints into account and reassigned houses that were close to each frontline worker's place of residence. So that's something that we could look to doing in the future. The other spontaneous adaptation that arose during the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, was frontline workers cooperating with each other for their own safety. So traveling together, or in some other instances, if they had too much household work and they needed to take time off from work, some frontline workers would volunteer to do other frontline workers meet their quota and meet their household survey quota. So I think that's my answer in brief, but I'm happy to go into any part of it.
Sure. I think what stood out to me personally was this aspect of supportive families, non-supportive families, neutral families,
right.
And that in itself is interesting, because we realize that there's a huge opportunity, at least in Bihar and UP, where we see this whole new cadre of ASHA facilitators that has been defined, but their role in itself is not very well defined, right? They're currently doing a lot of work of a regular ASHA, along with ensuring the ASHAs that are under them, which are 20-25 at times, to ensure that they're doing their work, and they're sort of monitoring their work largely. But in any purposive manner, and I think Babita's comments in the chat are quite resonating with that is there a way where ASHA's responsibilities or there's strata sort of gets, you get a promotion of sorts. You get to realize that, okay, you're doing better. Why don't you do it in a different way? And we realize that the facilitator role is not very well defined. And this has a great opportunity in terms of providing this kind of, supportive supervision, where we also saw that in the pandemic, it was the ASHA facilitators who ended up doing a lot of home-based, face-to-face training where ASHAs were struggling with the digital transition. So any reflections on that from you, Sanaya, or even Arpana, if you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So just to quickly touch on the supportive and unsupportive families, what we found from our qualitative insights were that families were along the spectrum. And on the supportive side of the spectrum, we saw stories of husbands like stepping in to help with frontline worker duties. So for example, getting on their own scooters to go to primary health centers to pick up some of the supplies that they were supposed to pick up for their job, or giving them lifts to places, to areas where they were supposed to do COVID survey work. And then we saw neutral families who didn't really do much one way or the other. But we did see instances of unsupportive families. Perhaps some of these instances were driven by fear of families themselves being infected by COVID. So families telling frontline workers that, we should stop this work and just sit at home. We are scared of COVID ourselves. Or in one instance, there was a story of a frontline worker who went and stayed in another village in the panchayat office because her survey work was so far away from the home, and and she stayed there for 2 months. But the family was unhappy about this and told her that she needed to do her own housework as well. So that's a quick response, but I think we should ask for a response from Arpana as well.
Arpana, please do come in.
I will allude to the ASHA facilitator bit in terms of supportive supervision, because that's some work that we are taking up in supportive supervision in OPM. So essentially, the ASHA facilitator cadre has a defined role. It's been there since 2013-14. But however, the absorption and the uptake at the state level has been very slow. I would say that the ASHA facilitator was essentially chosen from the ASHAs with the fact that the understanding of supportive supervision in background, that they are the people who were ASHAs earlier, so understand the context of ASHAs much better and are able to extend that support and contextualize the roles and functions in a much better way, and also provide them with creative solutions and innovative solutions which they have come across in negotiating and navigating the system and the community level challenges. So one of the lacunae that we see in the system has been in terms of training the ASHA facilitator in the role of an ASHA facilitator. The delineation of the role of an ASHA facilitator and an ASHA, and the differentiation that they are not ASHAs anymore, but supervisors of the ASHA. So what difference does it make to be a supervisor is something which needs to be handheld and supported through ongoing training and also post-training to get those skills of, the module that we developed for the government of Bihar under our frontline worker project was relating to certain skills of communication, certain skills of problem solving, creative thinking, and also group supervision, peer-to-peer support, and things like that, which can be operationalized in a much more supportive way and not a very punitive and a hierarchical way, not with a more people-centric approach, and also with a gender-sensitive, in a gender-sensitive manner, by way which we also sort of allude to the fact that there are a lot of systemic changes that are required. Systemic thinking is required to be able to incorporate that gender lens. For example, when the trainings are conducted for the home-based newborn care, so that's a 5-day residential training. Many ASHAs find it difficult because they have to leave a child at home. So the system has to have that flexibility to be able to make that provision that while the ASHA is staying there, so she can get a child along, and the provision for the child for food is also made along with the ASHA. And other things like when ASHAs are mandated to escort and stay in a health facility for more than 48 hours, so there has to be a provision of ASHA restroom, attached with toilets, with the basic needs that are taken into account for. So I would just end my comment there.
I know that there's a lot of points that we wanted to discuss. There were elements of the digital transition itself, and how is it that we can design a better way of transitioning into an efficient digital platform and system. And also, I think elaborating more on the aspects of motivation and how we now know through so many different studies that there are elements of motivation that, and most of these are happening in an ad hoc, informal way. ASHAs report that, but there's no formal recognition and building it into really program design itself. And and how can that be done? Those are some aspects that we wanted to touch on, but I know that we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank everyone. Thank you so much, Sanaya and Aparna, to be joining in on such a short notice and talking about all of this work. I think I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversations before the session itself and during the session. So thank you so much for that. Thank you, Pathways team, and thank you, CoreNet, for giving us this opportunity. And I hope that we sustain this dialogue through the working group that we have on frontline health workers, and hopefully continue this thought process forward. With that, I think I give it over to Nitya.
Thank you so much, Divya, Arpana, Damini, Monisha, and Sanaya. I think this has been an incredibly engaging conversation. And you're very right, Divya. I wish we had more time to kind of unpack all the things that we mentioned. But thank you for the plug-in. I think it would be great to have these kind of conversations within the FLW's working group as well. There has been a lot of action, so it'd be nice to maybe after a bit of a break, regroup and see how I guess everyone and the rest of the members in the group feel about these kinds of conversations. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us for this session. We do have a showcase by Intersection right after this, which is women participation in the workforce, the necessity during a crisis, which I think would actually be a really great continuation of the conversations and discussions we've been having here. So do stick around if you want to kind of stay around for that one. It's on the same link itself, so you don't have to leave or register again. You can just stay here. Also later at 4 p.m., we have a plenary on gendered economic impact, which is being co-anchored by LEAD, SEVA, and iWage. And tomorrow we have very many exciting sessions. We have a session on vaccine hesitancy, on misinformation, and a session on the review of budgetary trends in the arts and culture section. And a session that is unpacking the insights from the implementation of take-home ration program during COVID-19, among many others. But we'd also like to just mention that due to a few unforeseen circumstances, a few sessions from today and tomorrow have been rescheduled for the 7th of May. Those have been updated on the SCARE website, so do keep an eye out for the ones which have now moved to the 7th of May. And of course, you know, to kind of keep in touch and maybe read a little bit more about the Accountability Initiative project or the OPM projects, as well as the pathway studies, feel free to go to www.corenet.in, and you can follow us on Twitter at @corenet_India. And of course, if you're interested in joining the community of practice, feel free to reach out to us at hello@corenet.in. And once again, just thank you to all the speakers and the panelists of the session. It was really, really very, very interesting. So thank you.